I'm John Heilman.
And I'm Mark Halpern. And with all due respect to Steven Mnuchin, your name ID needs a little work.
Today, Trump is expected to pick Stephen Mnuchin.
Steve Mnuchin, Stephen Mnuchin.
Stephen Mnuchin.
Former Goldman Sachs executive Steve Mnuchin.
Former Goldman Sachs executive Steve Mnuchin.
Stephen Mnuchin.
Former Goldman Sachs executive Stephen Mnuchin.
Mnuchin led Trump's finance operations during the presidential campaign.
Among them, Stephen Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary.
We have got much munchin' to talk about tonight. It was not long ago that Donald Trump released a campaign television ad that counted the current CEO of Goldman Sachs among establishment elites who have, quote, robbed our working class. So, naturally, when it came time to pick nominees for top financial government agency jobs, Trump has turned to two East Coast educated billionaire buddies, one of whom cut his teeth at, you guessed it, Goldman Sachs. The great wide world is still trying to make sense of Trump's choices of Steve Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary and Wilbur Ross as Commerce Secretary. Both were early Trump campaign loyalists. They're both friends of his, to be sure, but their resumes are causing some cognitive dissonance up against the populist economic message that Trump preached out on the trail. Take, for instance, Mnuchin, the man Trump has trapped for Treasury. He was Trump's campaign national finance chair, not a ton, though, on the old CV that is likely to ingratiate him to Trump's working class supporters. He's a Yale man, Goldman Sachs partner. He founded his own hedge fund and once headed a mortgage lender that foreclosed on tens of thousands of homeowners while his institution was still receiving government support. He's also financed some big Hollywood blockbusters, including Avatar, X-Men, and about dozens of other movies over the last few years.
And then there's Wilbur Ross, a Yale and Harvard man. He became a billionaire investor and bet bigly on struggling American industries like steel, coal, and textiles. But he did help restructure one of Trump's struggling casinos in the 1990s when Trump has been criticized for leaving average workers high and dry. And his work to rehabilitate and resell companies overseas to overseas investors has benefited from the very free trade policies that Trump has promised to rein in. This morning, Mnuchin and Ross went on TV to talk about what they wanted to accomplish in a Trump administration.
Our number one priority is tax reform. This will be the largest tax change since Reagan. We think by cutting corporate taxes, we'll create huge economic growth and we'll have huge personal income. So the revenues will be offset on the other side.
Everybody talks about tariffs as the first thing. Tariffs are the last thing. Tariffs are part of the negotiation. The real trick is going to be increase American exports. Get rid of some of the tariff and non-tariff barriers to American exports.
So, Mark, look at these picks, Mr. Ross, Mr. Munchkin, a.k.a. Mnuchin, and their resumes. Is it fair to ask the question at this point, what ever happened to populist Donald Trump?
Oh, very fair. I mean, look, he could have gone a different way and made Bernie Sanders Treasury Secretary. To me, this stuff is symbolically almost ridiculous. But what's going to matter is the policies. And these two guys, they're not creatures of government. They're not long in Washington. If they end up helping formulate economic policies that help create middle-class, working-class jobs, no one's going to care about these items on their resume. But it is going to make for some interesting confirmation hearings. And it does put even more onus on Trump to recognize that biography is not necessarily destiny, but it influences things. He's going to have to come up with some populist thinking in his economic team, because I don't think it's going to come from these guys.
We talked yesterday about the fact that Trump has put on a lot of Congress-friendly people into the administration so far and is considering putting in a lot more. So there's that. Then there's these Goldman Sachs, Harvard, Yale guys. We'll talk about a little bit more about Mr. Mnuchin in a second, but just in general, I mean, I can't imagine anything that looks like draining the swamp or being a populist or being an outsider than the series of picks that Trump has made. And I think there's a lot of political peril ahead for Donald Trump if the people who elected him, because of their ire and anger at Washington, D.C., at business as usual, at the financial elite, at Wall Street, suddenly start to think that Donald Trump is turning into another crony capitalist. And that is what a lot of these appointments look like. Again, I have more to say about Mnuchin, which is problematic, but just alone, I think Trump is courting real danger here politically by thumbing his nose at the populist outrage that put him in office.
And yet, as best I can sample opinion in social media, talk radio, cable news, there's so much more outrage about Mitt Romney than there is about this. Well, I do think if you're giving Trump the benefit of the doubt that he's playing some grand strategic game in assembling his government, I do think that it is important, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, but particularly if you're an outsider, to send reassuring signals to Wall Street. Now, I don't really have a good sense of whether these two guys actually are going to reassure Wall Street like a Bob Rubin. Just because you got Goldman Sachs on your resume doesn't necessarily mean you'll be reassuring. But if that was the goal of picking them, and if he's going to pursue policies that create jobs, then I think it's a short-term hit, but it might be worth it because any president is going to want Wall Street to feel comfortable with the new administration. It's just a reality of how power works in America.
Right. Well, anyone's going to want the financial markets to be reassured by the person who's running the Treasury Department, but that's different from Wall Street in some ways. I know people conflate them. This guy, I think if you got Bob Rubin and Larry Summers and any of the past Treasury secretaries over the course of the past 20 years and asked them whether they knew Steve Mnuchin, thought that he was a reassuring signal, thought he knew anything about monetary policy, I'm pretty sure all of them would say no, because we had these discussions back when Mnuchin became the head of his finance committee, and he didn't reassure anybody then because no one on Wall Street really knew the guy.
One of the weaknesses Mitt Romney had when he ran for president is he never explained how he felt personally about what happened to people who lost their jobs or were hurt financially by the activities of Bain Capital. I really hope both these guys are pressed by both parties when they're up for confirmation, because both of them are involved in things that hurt consumers, hurt workers.
Yes.
Even if other times they were creating jobs.
I know the bell went off a long time ago, but we just got to say, just on Mnuchin, just focus. Some people need to focus on One West, on this bank out in California that the man owned. He's accused of having improperly foreclosed on homeowners, of redlining, a lot of bad stuff. We got to look into this more carefully as this nomination goes forward.
Congress does during the confirmation. He needs to explain how he feels about what happened.
Yes, the press does too.
All right. Donald Trump is doing a victory lap right now and into tomorrow over a deal that he and the Vice President-elect Mike Pence struck with Carrier Corporation. That's the air conditioning behemoth that was planning to start shipping a couple thousand jobs to Mexico next year. The company now says they're going to keep about 1,000 of those positions in Indiana, which is, of course, where Pence is still the governor. We don't know all the details of the deal yet. Trump and Pence are going to travel to Indianapolis tomorrow, and we'll probably talk at least about some additional terms of how exactly they were able to convince Carrier to stay. But it is the case that the deal includes some sort of pledge to work on what the Trump administration planned to work on, less federal regulation and an overhaul of the corporate tax code. But there are clearly some other, at least state inducements involved. The move, though, of course, is not without its detractors, particularly those who think of it as corporate government policy interference. So, John, clearly there's a big win for Donald Trump, even his detractors say so, for the most part. Is this a win for America?
Well, look, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of manufacturing jobs in this country and the kind of transformation that Donald Trump has promised. I think if Barack Obama had done something like this in the course of his 8 years, Republicans would be howling about picking winners, about industrial policy, about the intervention of government in the free market. And now Donald Trump is going to be hailed for having saved these jobs. I think it's bad economic policy. And I think it's incredibly hypocritical for Republicans to cheer this on when they would trash any Democrat who tried to do the same thing.
Governors do stuff like this all the time. I do think that part of what Trump has promised is for people to feel good about the country again, good about jobs not going overseas. I do think that industrial policy is dangerous. Trump's basic claim is going to be, I can do industrial policy because I'll do it better. I'll do it in a way that's better for the market. We'll see. I think that the country needs to feel the possibility of job creation. So in short term, I think it's fine. But I agree with you. Long term, this is the kind of industrial policy that's just not sensible. It's going to have every company in the country threatening to move to Mexico.
Correct. Exactly right. All right. Mark your calendars for the 15th of December. That is the day that Donald Trump says that he and his family will finally make a big and long-anticipated announcement about how the president-elect will, maybe, just maybe, extricate himself from his business empire amid vast concerns about conflicts of interest once he moves into the Oval Office. This morning, Trump logged onto his favorite press release phone app and posted this series of teaser tweets. Quote, I'll be holding a major news conference in New York City with my children on December 15th to discuss the fact that I'll be leaving my great business in order to fully focus on running the country to make America great again. While I am not mandated to do this under the law, I feel it is visually important as president to in no way have a conflict of interest with my various businesses. Hence, I love it when Trump uses the word hence. Hence, legal documents are being crafted which take me completely out of business operations. The presidency is a far more important task. That's the end of that tweet storm. So, Mark, having read that tweet storm, what are, in your view, I know there have got to be some, what are the most important unanswered questions that remain about how Trump is going to deal with his business about his business?
Exactly how far away from the business is he getting? Is he getting even close to creating something that people would look at as a blind trust? Will his family still have a role in the business and in government? Based on the tweets at face value, I think he's basically going to say he's no longer running the company, but still benefiting from the company, still knowing what assets there are. I think that unless we're pleasantly surprised, this is headed into a place that is not going to be acceptable. And I think a lot of Republicans in Congress are going to agree that it's not acceptable if it's headed in that direction.
The key phrase that a lot of government ethics experts are focusing on in those tweets is business operations, which I think is what you're referring to. You know, that he will no longer be actively managing his businesses. Big deal. If he continues to have a personal financial stake in those businesses and his kids are running them and there's nothing that remotely resembles a blind trust, or let alone the liquidation of the assets, the conflict of interest problems will remain. And they'll be just as great as they were if he were actually actively running the company. But him not actively running the company is like the minimum step, far from the maximum step, and far from enough to get us away from the problems that have been raised here.
It's so important for the country that he do this right. My one hope is, the one glimmer of hope I see is he's going to announce this over 2 weeks in advance. Yeah. There's still more time, I think, for people to try to influence this decision. And for him, the question they haven't answered is, whose ethical judgment is he using on this? They say he'll go every step he needs to, blah, blah, blah. They need to put forward someone whose ethical judgment on this stuff is pristine, who says this is how far you need to go to make this actually workable for the American people, even if it means giving up what has been your personal and professional identity for decades, your attachment to your business.
Let's be clear. The top ethics lawyer in the Obama administration, the top ethics lawyer in the Bush administration have come together in a bipartisan fashion and said what's required here, which is liquidation and a blind trust. The Wall Street Journal's editorial page agrees. That's the standard I'm using.
Yep. All right. I agree. Nothing short of that will work. We'll talk about the leadership election that House Democrats held today with an unsurprising result after these words from our sponsors.
Last week on this particular television program, Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan told us that he had decided to challenge Nancy Pelosi for the job of House Democratic leader because his party doesn't win anymore. Well, the vote was this morning, and the winner is Nancy Pelosi. The House Minority Leader kept her post by pulling in 134 votes, but 63 Democrats, about a third of her caucus, cast secret ballots for Ryan. Mark, this vote comes in a moment when the Democratic Party has just suffered another election day drubbing and are in a state of ideological disarray. So I ask you, what does the decision to stick with Nancy Pelosi say about how seriously the Democrats are taking their moment of reckoning?
I mean, look, had they toppled Pelosi, there would have been more disarray. And while Tim Ryan is a guy with some strengths, I don't think he was going to lead them back to the promised land. You know, a lot of Democrats who even in the House, they're so consumed with the presidential and the problems there. The soul searching within the party should have begun a long time ago because, of course, during the last 8 years, they've lost the House and the Senate. They've lost a lot of governorships, a ton of state legislative seats. And so I think today's result on balance, because of the alternative, was probably better for the party because they need some stability now. And Pelosi has a lot of fundraising and other strengths. But, man, they need some change, and today did not bring it.
Right. I got to say, I have a lot of sympathy for Tim Ryan. I think he is making a lot of important arguments that the party needs to focus on kind of places that he hails from, Youngstown, Ohio. I'm very sympathetic to his cause. On the other hand, I do agree with the arguments you just made, and I'll say that in the end, the legislative leader from the minority in the House is not the defining political or ideological figure in the party. It is someone who needs to be able to really work the legislative levers to maximize what limited leverage Democrats have in the House of Representatives, and there's no one better at that than Nancy Pelosi. She is a huge ideological albatross in some ways around the party, and it sends a terrible message that they're sticking with her. But she's probably the best person at actually running a floor fight, which is what the Democrats are going to be in a lot of if they're going to try to restrain Donald Trump and the Republicans over the next at least 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, where do stars come from? Where do people with big ideas, star power, the ability to transform a party in whatever direction it needs to go. Where do they come from? History suggests a lot of them come from the governors, maybe from a senator. Rarely does anybody come to that level from the House. It happens, but
Paul
rarely.
Ryan. Paul Ryan's the rare exception.
Paul Ryan, Newt Gingrich.
Right.
But the party right now needs ideas.
Yes.
And they need ideas and show that they work. And as you suggested, somebody in the minority in the House is not going to be able to put forward ideas and say, yeah, these are great ideas. Here's how they're changing the real lives of real people.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. So it's the least important battleground of places where they need to start advancing young leaders. I mean, the Senate's important, governors, statewide office holders in other big states.
I was struck when Ryan was on the show by both the arguments he was making were impressive, but they seemed to me better suited to a man who was running for the DNC chair rather than running for the minority leader in the House. All right.
I kept forgetting that that's what he was running for.
Yeah,
I kept thinking he was running for DNC
I know.
chair.
We felt the same way. All right. We'll be right back with the man of steel. That would be former Republican Party Chairman Michael Steele, who joins us after this quick break.
Our next guest regularly steals the spotlight. I'm referring, of course, to Michael Steele, the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, and a man who likes to be seen whenever possible. Chairman, welcome.
What's up, man? How you doing?
You've been in public elective office in Maryland. You've been the state National Party chair. You also, as some establishment ties, but you've got a great feel for the grassroots. Explain to me the mystery. Why is the grassroots of the party, the populist wing, not rebelling at the notion of all these billionaires in economic policy positions?
Well, there's a little bit of a quiet rebellion going along right now. There are folks who are not happy. Some of that has been articulated by Kellyanne Conway, and we've seen how that's kind of played itself out in a broader sense. But there is some concern that folks, they'll want to have a wait and see. They trust Donald Trump on a lot of this. They think that there's a method to his madness, if you will, in regards to bringing in people who some would perceive to be as part of making the swamp and using them instead to help clean the swamp. So we'll see how that first 100 days goes, how those policies roll out, sort of backing off on certain things. People are kind of raising their eyebrows a little bit. But I think by and large, Donald Trump himself is getting a greater pass on this than I think any other Republican in his position would at this point.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've got, they're selling access at the convention. You give $1 million. I mean, at the inauguration, give $1 million, you get access. This is the swamp personified. When the phrase "drain the swamp" was chanted at those Trump rallies in the Midwest, in Iowa, in Wisconsin, and Michigan, what do you think people thought that meant?
Good question. Well, from what I understand and what I myself thought it meant was we're not going to play in that swamp anymore. In fact, we're going to drain it, meaning we're not going to rely on the establishment types to get the job done. We're not going to rely on those who are at the teat of the government to help us get the job done. We're going to bring in new voices, new faces, men and women who are outside of this complex, if you will, and have them come in with this idea, the core idea of making America great again across the board. Now, you can argue that bringing in a lot of these folks, particularly those who've never had government service under their belt, is a form of doing that. They just happen to be billionaires. He didn't say that he wouldn't use billionaires to help drain the swamp. In fact, he quite along the way said that there were a lot of these guys like Icahn and others that he wanted to bring into the table because they had a real-world experience that Washington was missing. And I think that, Mark, is where folks are beginning really kind of trust him more on his instincts about what these individuals can do relevant to this idea of making America great again and cleaning the swamp at the same time.
Billionaires are good drainers, apparently.
Well, apparently.
So, Michael, I'm looking at your incredible Argyle sweater, though. It's very strong. I have a Christmas gift, early Christmas gift for you here. I got a T-shirt right here. I'm showing it on television. It's my Team Bigley T-shirt. I'm going to give this to you next time I see you at Christmas. I'm going to give you your own Team Bigley T-shirt because you could be one of the co-captains of Team Bigley. So here's the question. Here's the question I want to ask you. So look, you've got the Goldman Sachs, you got the billionaires, right? You got a bunch of members of Congress who've been appointed already, and a bunch of others who are being considered. You've got Trump backing away from repealing Obamacare on day one. You've got Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross on television today saying, well, maybe actual tariffs against China isn't really what we want to do. We don't want to actually slap big import duties against foreign companies, against foreign governments. What is the place where all of this to me signifies political peril for Trump, right? These are all places, there's a whole variety of things. So what's the thing that Trump could do, you think, that could actually turn his voters, his supporters away from him? What's the red line that he can't cross?
You know, that's another good question. I don't think there's a singular red line. I think that it's a combination, a culmination, if you will, of everything you're saying. Look, if the backing down off of Obamacare combined with the a softer approach to immigration, where the wall isn't 10 feet, it's actually a foot and a half. Those types of things in combination, I think will do a lot of damage. Because, look, there was a lot of buy-in to this idea that you're going to come in and shake this system, that you're going to turn it out. The voters said for the first time, and you guys have talked about this and reported on this, that they controlled this. We got this, not the establishment, not the people who kind of pull the levers from behind the scenes, but we, the people, have this. And that's why they stuck with Trump. When the Never Trump stuff started, when Romney was out there doing his thing, when all these folks were piling on, they stayed true and gave him 14 million more votes than anybody had ever received as a Republican nominee. So Trump cannot lose sight of that. Okay. And I think that if he starts in combination of looking like old Washington, he's going to have a real rough time of it.
So let me ask you a question, ask you to pretend like you're a Democrat for a moment. I know you're familiar with a lot of Democrats in your state in Maryland, so you know you've run a party. So if you were running the Democratic Party right now, would you advise the Democrats to have the approach to Trump that Republicans had to Obama, which is say oppose him on absolutely everything, or would you advise Democrats to kind of lay back and let Trumpism potentially collapse under the weight of its own contradictions?
I think more of the latter. I think you engage on policy-specific issues. You cannot approach this with a broad brush, because what will happen is when Trump pushes back, you wind up sweeping too much off the table. What I did when I was chairman, walking in the same shoes that the new party chairman for the DNC is going to walk into, party on the rebound, just lost a bruising election to a guy that you're sitting there scratching your head going, well, how the hell did this happen? And what I did was figured out where the targets were, number one, what were the subject matters that was going to drive my base. And once you're able to identify those, you bring the base into that and you start from there. But if you do something too big, I think it winds up to bite you.
Mr. Chairman, we've got a million more questions for you, but the time gods are saying we got to go. So, Michael Steele, thank you so much. We're going to talk more about the Democrats and what the House caucus vote today means right after this.
Nancy Pelosi was reelected today as the head of the House Democrats amid calls from some in her party for new leadership in Congress. Joining us now from the home of Congress, that would be Capitol Hill, to talk about that vote and its implications, the great, magnificent, fantastic, wunderbar. All right, Casey Hunt. Casey, good to have you.
Fine.
So Nancy Pelosi wins. She wins easily, and yet a third of the caucus votes against her. So among friends, we're going to have one on in a moment, and supporters of Congresswoman Pelosi, are they like freaked out a little bit by the fact that a third of the caucus was against her, or do they feel confident like this was a real mandate for her?
I think that there is some frustration, and there was certainly some surprise at the number of people who picked or who backed Congressman Tim Ryan. I think it showed you that had somebody else been willing to step up against Pelosi, say Joe Crowley, for example, the congressman from New York, they might have actually beaten Pelosi in this. So it does show that there's some legitimate problems there for her. I do think that they feel like at the end of the day, this was still a demonstration that Pelosi's style of politics is what the Democrats need in the House right now. They need somebody who basically has that iron will that she's become known for. In an age of Trump, that the House Democrats are essentially going to serve more at least an attempt to stand in his way to force Republicans to make difficult decisions on, say, the debt ceiling, some of these other issues. She has been there in the trenches. She knows how to do it. And I think her allies feel like that's what they need right now. On the flip side, it also means that they're not going to have any new faces. The average leadership age on the Democratic side in the House is 76 years old. It's under 50 years old on the Republican side, which is an entire generation. And I think that's the frustration that you saw expressed today from those 63 members who refused to back her.
So, Casey, now Nancy Pelosi is going to be in charge again. If all goes as planned for her, if they get every break, if they execute perfectly, what's like her scenario for 2017 that's like a good year for the House Democrats?
Well, it's tricky as always. I mean, they sort of have been bleeding ever since Nancy Pelosi, ended her speakership. I think one of the key areas of real frustration for the people who opposed her is the chairmanship of the campaign committee charged with re-electing Democrats. I think there's a real feeling that the focus and the strategy that Pelosi has brought to that involves a lot of fundraising. It involves messaging that really appeals to people on the coasts of the country, but that is missing out on the middle. And so I think the challenge for Pelosi going into the next election cycle is to figure out, okay, how do we balance, the main message of the Democratic Party, what it's become, the people who actually, voted in larger numbers for Hillary Clinton than for Donald Trump in the popular vote, while still expanding the number of seats that they have. That is a very tricky line to walk, and it's not clear to me yet how they plan on doing it.
Casey, on a different topic, we talked a little bit earlier in the show about Trump's kind of placeholder about trying to deal with his business, his family business, and potential conflicts of interest. Setting this thing December 15th, he's going to come out. My sense is that a lot of Republican members of Congress are really concerned about this right now. What's your sense about the temperature among, Republicans on the Hill related to this issue?
Right now, when I've talked to Republicans up here about it, they have essentially said, let's give Donald Trump half a minute to deal with this. But they are saying, in saying that, they're saying he does need to deal with it. And I think that there has been some pressure, because the reality is the difficulty day to day for the members up here is having to answer for every single one of these things that Trump says or does, or, in this case, his conflicts of interest. I think the fact that he has come out and said, hey, I'm going to make a statement, will mollify some of them for now. I think they're probably going to expect to see some action. I think that this kind of general way of interacting is going to be something that drives a lot of what we talk about for the next year or so, this tension. I think you're already seeing it play out in the cabinet picks, for example. I had one Republican say to me, does Trump really want to make us vote for a David Petraeus or a Rudy Giuliani for Secretary of State? That would put us in a very difficult position. So I think you're already seeing those pressures ramp up across the board. That issue that you raised is one good example.
All right, Casey Hunt, magnificent to see you. Thank you for your service.
Lovely to see you, gentlemen. I appreciate you having me.
We're now going to turn to a supporter of the California Congresswoman and fellow member of the Golden State delegation, Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell. Congressman, let me ask you this. Your woman won, Nancy Pelosi, going to lead your party again in the House, but she lost a third of the caucus. So what do you think she should take as the message from that large block of dissenters from having her lead the caucus again going forward?
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Mark. First time on. And our leader won. She earned the trust of 68% of her colleagues. She said that she had 66%, so she came in a little bit higher than she expected. It shows that she can still count and she can still lead us forward. So I think a good day for Democrats, and now unifying and going forward to defend the progress we've made on the Affordable Care Act, climate change, and Wall Street reform, and also craft a message that can connect with all Americans going forward.
Congressman, I appreciate that answer, but didn't answer my question, which was what Nancy Pelosi should take from the fact that a third of the caucus voted against her.
Well, I look at it as over 2/3 voted for her, and I think this was a healthy exercise for the caucus, and she still has overwhelming support from the party. And I hope the people that voted against her, and I believe they will step up and help us in an all-hands-on-deck effort to shape what's next.
Congressman, thanks for being on. Can you think of any issues on which Leader Pelosi is more liberal than working class voters typically are in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan?
Working class voters want an economy that's going to work for all of us. So I think the work that she did, especially around Wall Street reform, really matters to working class people. They just want a fair shot. And right now you're seeing Donald Trump putting out a plan to unravel Dodd-Frank. Instead of draining the swamp, he's refilling it with recycled water by putting Wall Street executives and D.C. insiders in his cabinet. And so I think our message is going to connect with those voters.
Right. Again, I'll just say, are there any issues you can name just one, where you think she might be to the left of the voters who helped Donald Trump get elected in those states?
Yeah, and I think the voters, they're electing representatives in their own community. And this is not about one person, representing every part of the Democratic Party. I think she's going to rely on different people in our party to go across the country and carry that unifying message of an opportunity for all of us. So I reject the idea that this is on one person's shoulders. She has given opportunities to people like me. Look, I was first in my family to go to college. I came to Congress with $100,000 in student loan debt, and she said, go talk to all the millennials about issues from people who have the same issues and take other young members and do it. We created a group called Future Forum. We went to 31 cities, and we have legislation to help lift 40 million people out of student loan debt. So she's trusting other members in our caucus to not just have her be the leader, but for all of us to play a role.
So, Congressman, let me ask you this question that I asked Michael Steele, which is it your view that the way Democrats should approach Donald Trump and his agenda is the way that Republicans in Congress approached Barack Obama and his agenda, which is to say, cooperate with nothing, oppose at every quarter? Or do you think you should try to make common cause with Trump where you can find areas of agreement?
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that Donald Trump is a man who has no core set of principles. He is willing to say one thing and do another. And so, it's very hard to tell what he truly believes in. But if he truly does believe in reforming and upgrading our country's transportation and infrastructure networks, then I think we can work with him. But if what he means by that is just corporate tax breaks and no real investments from the federal government, then I don't see us being able to work with him on that. If he is sincere about campaign finance reform and repealing Citizens United and taking outside money out of politics, we can work with him on that, and we should work with him on that.
All right, Congressman Swalwell, thank you for coming on the show, making your first appearance, and doing a pretty nice job. Up next, more on that man named Munchkin, or Mnuchin, whichever. We'll talk to a reporter whose profile of Donald Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary goes all the way back to Munchkin's college days, or Mnuchin's. And if you happen to be watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Back in August, Bloomberg Business Week published a story titled "Trump's Top Fundraiser Eyes the Deal of a Lifetime." And almost exactly 3 months later, that top fundraiser, Steve Mnuchin, did get a really big deal for payoff for his deal. He was nominated for Treasury Secretary. Joining us now is one of the writers into that Business Week profile, Bloomberg News reporter Max Abelson. Max, welcome. What kind of guy is Mnuchin? Is he funny? Is he stuffy? What's he like?
I think if you're gonna make up a book, write a novel about a guy who just had the perfect elite career where just everything went his way, it would be Steve Mnuchin. At Yale, he was a publisher of the YDN, the Yale Daily News. He was in Skull and Bones. Then he joined Goldman Sachs, where his dad had been a partner, and also a partner who was so beloved that everyone called him Coach. He made partner at Goldman Sachs himself. Then Stephen went and ran hedge fund money, including, by the way, for George Soros. Then once he was done with that, he became a Hollywood producer. Then, of course, if you remember, he bought a bank with a bunch of billionaires, sold that, and now he's going to be apparently the next Secretary of the Treasury.
Is he ideological in any way?
I think the question about what Steve Mnuchin believes in is something that honestly nobody knows. I think the thing that people really associate him with, and what's so astounding, is that he was sort of at the top of Goldman Sachs. And now he's going to be joining, by the way, Steve Bannon, his former Goldman Sachs colleague, Gary Cohn, the current president of Goldman Sachs, was at Trump Tower yesterday. And Trump transition team member Anthony Scaramucci, apparently he's going to have a Trump job as well.
Yeah, so... Hillary Clinton who Donald Trump excoriated for palling around with Goldman Sachs, for giving speeches in secret to Goldman Sachs, getting paid a lot of money to give speeches to Goldman Sachs. Does this not reek of the most kind of rank hypocrisy?
I think that if you were to list the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost, the fact that people sort of just assumed that she was really close, if not socially, but also ideologically with Wall Street, that's got to be one of the top reasons. People were really suspicious that if she made it to the White House, she would bring along all of her Wall Street friends. And by the way, Hillary Clinton does have Wall Street friends, people in finance.
Turns out Donald Trump has a lot of Wall Street friends, too.
Donald Trump does, too.
Not a big distinction.
But this morning, I made some calls, and I said to hedge fund managers and bank executives, do you think Trump supporters who loved it when he attacked Wall Street, do you think they're going to be disappointed? Do you think they're going to be angry? They might be angry. Their attitude was like,
yeah, but the hedge fund people have no clue what Trump supporters think or feel. So here's my question. I want to ask about Mnuchin, because that's why you're here. One West. Let's talk about the One West ownership I mentioned earlier in the show. This is a bank, a mortgage lender out in California that's been accused of foreclosing in a rapacious kind of pernicious way on homeowners. It's been accused of redlining. There are a lot of housing activists who are up in arms about his ownership of that. What can you tell us about his ownership of One West?
You hit it on the head. I think that's going to be one of the most important questions of the next few months. All right, so listen to this. Stephen Mnuchin told Zach Miter and I that he was sitting in his office in New York in 2008 watching TV. I actually got this story confirmed by someone who was in the room with him at the time. It was summer of 2008. He's watching TV, the news, and he sees people lined up to pull their money out of a bank called IndyMac. And he says to himself, I have seen this game before. We're going to make money on this. We are going to buy this bank. And he bought that bank. It was IndyMac. And IndyMac was, it was a failed bank. In fact, I think it was one of the biggest bank failures in the history of the United States up until that point. Steve Mnuchin bought it with John Paulson, hedge fund manager, big Trump friend. He bought it with George Soros, as I mentioned. And he rebranded it. So what you just mentioned, One West, is exactly what it's called now. And I think it was profitable within a few months. The FDIC, by the way, guaranteed that after a certain point, they weren't going to have to eat up any of the losses. So they got a great deal on it. Yep. To be fair to Stephen Mnuchin, in the same way that you kind of have to sort of just admire the fact that he made this bet on Donald Trump when everyone else just assumed he was going to lose, you also have to admire the bet he made on his bank. I mean, he bought this bank just at the bottom. Things were terrible. So he had a good instinct. But on the other hand, he sold it to CIT for, I think, more than $3 billion. They made a ton of money. And there are nonprofits that say that One West really stands out for sort of awful foreclosure practices. There's a group, a nonprofit, that accused them of foreclosing, I think, on something like 36,000 homes. Somewhere, I'm pretty sure it's more than 30,000. And more importantly than that, yeah, they accuse them of basically not going into neighborhoods that are predominantly black and predominantly Latino. One West CIT denies that, but he's going to be facing some pretty serious questions, I think, over the next couple weeks.
Okay, Max, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We will be right back to talk nominations and Mike Pence's trip to Washington and more right after this.
Welcome back. We're joined now by two of Bloomberg's finest. Up in Boston, senior national political reporter Jennifer Jacobs. And in our nation's capital, we have the senior White House correspondent, Margaret Talev. And man, there's the level of quality, the star power in this block, staggering. Jacobs, my question to you, I just got an email from Donald J. Trump, which announces the Donald J. Trump USA Thank You Tour 2016, which basically just gives the timing and the venue for the event in Cincinnati that we already knew about. What more do you know about the Thank You Tour?
Yeah, we broke the news a couple days ago that they were going to start this tour on Thursday night. What we know is it's not just going to go to swing states. It's going to go to places that, mean something to Donald Trump and to his campaign. We know the schedule. We were told it's for planning purposes only. I don't know that they've released it publicly yet. But I do know that one place that they're going to go is Mobile, Alabama, which is a place that's really special for Trump and his campaign. They attracted about 30,000 people there last summer in August of 2015. It was a symbolic moment for them when they really realized that they had a movement going on and that they could take this somewhere.
I remember that event well. Anybody who wants to read about it should go back and look at Will Leach's great piece about that Mobile, Alabama rally. Margaret, you're in Washington, D.C., where Mike Pence was today. Tell us about the role Pence is playing in this transition, and particularly in the Capitol?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting to watch so far. Look at where Mike Pence has been in some really important places and deals, really just within the last 24 hours. All over that carrier deal, Indiana's role, the Heartland's role, the Midwest's role, meeting with Condoleezza Rice, a meeting that you can imagine would have been more difficult with Donald Trump. We were looking at 2 Twitter feeds. Mike Pence's, where he was talking about his meeting with his good friend Condi Rice, and Condi Rice's, her last tweet, October 8th, says enough. And if you click the link, it's a link to a Facebook page saying that Donald Trump should not be president of the United States. So there you have it, Jeb Hensarling. In many ways, Mike Pence offers for Trump some version of what Joe Biden offered to President Obama, and but with sort of an added twist, which is that he's got the governor experience as well as the congressional experience. You know, the reaching across the aisle part is maybe a little more difficult for Mike Pence, given his legislative record, his ideological record. But in terms of persona, in terms of countenance, how he carries himself, and longstanding alliances with policy thinkers as well as elected officials, he is a real asset to Trump in these early days of this transition so far.
Jennifer, all this focus on personnel, what do we know about the policy development that's going on? Is it the case, for instance, that they're locked in on trying to start with the big things of tax reform and infrastructure?
Well, we got some hints today from Steve Mnuchin. He talked about how he wants to do this middle-class tax cut and not give a tax cut to the upper class, which is a reversal from what Trump's plan during the campaign trail had said. And we're also hearing other things like Anthony Scaramucci, who is one of Trump's transition advisors, has gave an interview to Bloomberg Radio today talking about how tariffs are not going to be imposed only as a last-ditch measure, whereas, during the campaign trail, Trump talked about as much as a 45% tariff on China. So we're getting little bits and pieces from Trump advisors now showing that they are coming together, creating ideas. I also happen to know that the transition team has a plan written up for building the wall, just using fees and not tapping money from Mexico or forcing Mexico to pay for it. Whether Trump actually goes with that plan or not is still up in the air. But they are doing the subterranean effort of really plotting policy, getting ready to go, getting executive orders, a tsunami of executive orders ready to go for those first couple days.
Margaret, we keep hearing about how the President Obama is still talking to Donald Trump, still very much on track to help with the transition. The White House was in a little bit of shock after Election Day. What's the sort of modus operandi for the administration here in their final 2 months in office?
I mean, look, there's a few things going on. For President Obama himself, this was happening beforehand anyway. It would have happened to some degree had Hillary Clinton been the president-elect right now. But President Obama is trying to figure out how much time he can rest and how much time he has left before he has to reemerge as some kind of a public figure, or at least slightly behind-the-scenes figure, how to tip the scales on that. I think the situation with Carrier is really instructive for the Obama White House. You saw a little bit of irritation today in the White House briefing when Josh Earnest was asked about it, and he said, I'm going to paraphrase here, so he said if he does that 804 more times, he will have matched the standard set by Obama. So President Obama, of course, spent a lot of time going around to manufacturing plants trying to highlight policies that he thought worked and took over during this massive financial crisis. I think partly frustrating, partly bewildering, and partly instructive for the Obama White House to watch Trump's early moves and to try to guess how long will it take before we see whether they succeed or fail or a little bit of both. So a tremendous amount of calibration inside the White House as far as President Obama himself and some of his key policy advisors. For the White House staff, I'd say there's still a tremendous amount of sadness and frustration and attempt by a lot of Democrats in this town to figure out what they are going to go on to do, what jobs will be available for them in these coming weeks and months.
We have very few seconds left. Margaret, yes or no? Tom Perez running for DNC chair, yes or no?
I'd say yes, sure, why not?
Okay, fantastic. Jennifer Jacobs, next big appointment to be announced by Trump in the cabinet is?
Defense, hopefully defense.
Defense, all right. Margaret Tlaib, Jennifer Jacobs, you guys were as awesome as I said you would be. Thanks for making me look good. And thank you for coming back. We'll be right back.
Find out what Wall Street is saying about Donald Trump's latest cabinet picks right now. It's on BloombergPolitics.com. Bloomberg Technology is next. Until tomorrow, thanks for watching. We'll see you then. Same bad time, same bad channel. Sayonara.